Hey everyone, and welcome to WDIM News, my weekly podcast where I talk about sci-fi stuff and some other stuff. My name is Eric. Thank you for joining me this week for a very busy episode. Today, I'll be basically covering everything that happened at Comic-Con in San Diego this year concerning Star Trek, and it was a lot of stuff. So first, I'll be discussing the long-awaited crossover episode between Star Trek Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks titled Those Old Scientists. Now, you may be saying to yourself, wait a minute, what about the episode that released on Thursday, Lost in Translation? Well, I had an inkling that Paramount may be releasing an episode at Comic-Con over the weekend, so I actually did a special video for Lost in Translation and released it on Thursday. It was a fantastic episode of Star Trek II, and I think if there's anything not great about releasing the crossover episode early, is that everyone has already forgotten about the episode before that. Which is unfortunate because that is a great episode, and if you did watch it, please check out my video about that episode, which I will leave a link to in the description below. But Paramount did release the 7th episode of the 2nd season of Strange New Worlds at Comic-Con, and then released it to the public hours later, which is super smart, because Paramount got a lot out of a Comic-Con that was missing some big studios like Marvel and DC, and used it to their advantage by making a big splash with Star Trek. So after I discuss the crossover episode and go over all the Easter eggs, and as you can probably imagine, there were a ton, I will also discuss what else was released at Comic-Con, including details on the final 3 episodes of the season from Strange New Worlds, and honestly, they all look epic, along with the trailer for Season 4 of Lower Decks, and a sneak peek scene from the 5th and final season of Discovery. While fans were also hoping for an update about the upcoming series Starfleet Academy and the film Section 31, there were no real mention of them, possibly due to the writers and actors strike pausing both productions. But before I get into all of this, I want to thank you for clicking on this video and ask that you hit that like button right now, which really helps out my channel. Also, make sure that you are subscribed for future videos. So first, let's talk about that episode of Strange New Worlds and sort of Lower Decks 2 titled Those Old Scientists. Man, what can I say about this episode? I loved it. I thought that it was a great love letter to the fans. But at the end of the day, I just think that this was just a great episode. And I hear a lot of people in fandoms talking about they're not happy where their fandom is. Like, they're not excited about, future Star Wars. They're not excited about future Lord of the Rings projects. This episode makes me so excited about the future of Star Trek because it showcases the 2 best properties that Paramount has under Star Trek right now. And they do it in a really good way. It doesn't seem like it's just a cash grab and that they're just doing this to make, one series more popular or perhaps the other series more popular. And I'm really surprised that we haven't really seen anything like this before in Star Trek. I think there were probably 2 situations that were similar. One would be the film Star Trek Generations, in which Picard meets Kirk in the Nexus. But really, that film felt like a passing of the torch. It wasn't showcasing the cast of the original series as well as the cast of Next Generation. It was really just showcasing those 2 characters and how one was kind of passing the mantle to the other, and that, Jean-Luc Picard was now the center of the Star Trek universe. So not really the same thing as this. And then we also have the Deep Space Nine episode, Trials and Tribulations, in which the cast of DS9 goes back to an episode of the original series and tries to interact. Now, that is very different because really those 2 casts aren't interacting. They just used footage from the original series episode and then cut in members of DS9 to look like they're interacting with those characters, which was awesome. It's one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek ever, Trials and Tribulations. But again, not really the same thing. You don't have new content. And in this case, you very much do. You have, the cast of Strange New Worlds showing off their camaraderie, how well they work together. And then you also have Boimler and Mariner from Lower Decks, and they seemed so much like their characters from the series. And I think that this crossover episode was so successful because it didn't feel like a ratings grab, but more like a love letter to the fans of Star Trek. Also, things that happened before the episode continued to move along in this episode for both crews, meaning that this is not just a bottle episode that does not matter to the greater storyline of either series. I keep coming back to the Family Guy Simpsons crossover when I think of like bad crossovers. And for the record, I don't really think that's a bad episode of the series. I think that it makes me laugh. The Family Guy Simpsons crossover, it definitely makes me laugh, but it's just too silly. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I think members of both casts have mentioned events that happen, but those cartoons are so silly that it's not really the same thing. And when that happened, it really did feel like a cash grab for both series because The Simpsons and the Family Guy are both kind of weird with their fandoms. Like, The Simpsons still have supposedly a very strong fandom, but I don't know one person that still watches The Simpsons, but apparently their ratings are always super high. But I could not tell you one person that I know that still watches The Simpsons. And Family Guy, I still watch, but I do think that the show is getting very repetitive. It's some of the same jokes. You can tell that Seth MacFarlane is not a writer on the series. And combining these two casts when they did, the Family Guy cast and the Simpsons cast, was an effort to reinvigorate both fan bases to say, hey, if you used to like The Simpsons and maybe you like Family Guy now, check out The Simpsons again. They're still pretty good, and vice versa. So that is not what I felt like in this episode. While I'm sure that they did want people who watch Strange New Worlds to check out Lower Decks because Strange New Worlds is the more popular property right now, I don't think that that was the main focus. I think that the focus was to write a great episode. And you could tell that by not just the cast, but also who they got to direct it. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit as well. But just from like A to Z, I thought everything was really great on how they set up this episode and made it a crossover episode that felt like it meant something. And it wasn't just this like one-time thing that nobody's going to reference again. I also thought it was really cool how both shows, Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks, have different tones. Like Lower Decks is almost always silly. I mean, they do touch on some issues from time to time if you haven't watched the series before. But for the most part, it is like adult humor. It's not like silly like Bugs Bunny, but it is silly to the point of where like most of the plot lines don't make a lot of sense and most of the villains are kind of funny in a way. And then you have Strange New Worlds that's all over the place with their tones. You know, one week we'll have a horror themed episode. One week we'll have a time travel, you know, and down the list. I mean, Strange New Worlds has shown that they can do every type of Star Trek episode. And somehow in this episode of Strange New Worlds, they were able to combine the tone of Lower Decks and instill it in their characters and make them very much the same characters they are on Lower Decks. And they didn't really feel out of place. Like they're supposed to feel a little out of place because they are out of place. You know, they're from the future and that I think worked. But for the most part, I still saw those animated characters on screen, even though it was live action. And I just love that. I thought that that was so smart. You know, I think the MCU kind of gets into trouble with that. Like when they have their own movies and then they have those like crossover movies like the Avengers. For instance, a lot of people have mentioned that the Guardians of the Galaxy movies have a different tone. And when those characters interact with like the Avengers and those style movies, the characters don't sound like the same characters in the Guardians of the Galaxy because they're written by other writers. It's a different movie and all that stuff. And I didn't feel that in this episode of Star Trek. I felt very much like the characters Boimler and Mariner kept true to who they are on their series and just brought that with them and kind of just like spilled that everywhere on the Enterprise. I also felt like this season, I think that this was the first episode that referenced Pike's future. I know that was a big part of the first season where almost every episode had something to do with Pike and how he was going to deal with his future until ultimately the season finale, which was basically just about that. You know, we see in this episode that Pike is still worrying about his future. It's still weighing heavily on him, but it's not said on screen every week. You know, like we don't have to continually touch on this plot line that everybody pretty much knows about now. They did touch on it in this episode, partially because maybe not everyone has seen every episode of Strange New Worlds, and they don't know, like, oh, is this a part of Strange New Worlds if they only know about the plot line from the original series that has to do with Captain Pike. But I think it also helped this episode because the fact that La'an and Pike had already time traveled helped this situation. And that just shows good writing. The writers on Strange New Worlds were able to set that up throughout this season and last. It helped the plot line of this episode to move along. And I just thought that was really smart. I know I kind of mentioned this already, but I really loved how close the live action versions of Brad Boimler and Beckett Mariner were to their animated counterparts. The only note I have about this is that Jack Quaid and Tawny Newsome may have to do this again because I really think that the fans are going to love this episode. And I think that them showing up on this series may allow them to, hey, show up on that new series, Star Trek Starfleet Academy. Wouldn't that be great if at some point during that first season, Boimler and Mariner are sent back or sent to the future maybe, because we're not sure about when Starfleet Academy is going to take place, although most people think it will be during the 32nd century, which is where Star Trek Discovery is right now. So to have Jack Quaid and Tawny Newsome now go to the future I mean, that kind of writes itself, doesn't it? I mean, they did such a good job in this episode. Jack Quaid, he is a great actor. He's done a lot of things. I think that Star Trek got Jack Quaid at like the perfect point. Like, he had done a few things. He had done the Hunger Games, but this was before Scream and all the other things that he had done, and especially The Boys. And now he's pretty much a big star, and we still have him in Star Trek. So I love that the producers and the creator of Lower Decks were able to see like, oh, Jack Quaid is going to be a star. We need to get him as soon as possible and make him Brad Boimler. And he just does such a great job with that character. Tawny Newsome also was awesome at Beckett Mariner. And I'm just going to say this. I thought Tawny Newsome looked fantastic in a Starfleet uniform. Probably my favorite since the episode that I mentioned, DS9 Trials and Tribulations, where Terry Farrell dressed in the, that skirt uniform and had the beehive hair. Probably only second to that, in my opinion, Beckett Mariner in live action form. I know that Jerry Ryan exists. I said what I said. I really liked Tawny Newsome in a Starfleet uniform, and as Forrest Gump would say, that's all I have to say about that. I also thought in this episode, I loved that moment when Brad Boimler gets on the bridge of the Enterprise, and the show actually puts us in the perspective, like through Brad Boimler's eyes when he first walks onto the bridge. I just thought that was brilliant, because even though I've seen the bridge of the Enterprise, obviously this is the 17th episode of Strange New Worlds, I've seen it 17 times at least, I really felt like this was almost the first time I was walking on the bridge, and it kind of made me feel like I would be even more annoying than Brad Boimler was if this happened to me. I think that I would be referencing more stuff. I think I would be changing more people's futures. I don't think I would be able to contain myself. As annoying as Boimler was to the rest of the crew, I think I would have been worse. I think I would have been in the brig in the first 26 hours. My final kind of comment about this, the fact that this episode is directed by Jonathan Frakes is just icing on the cake. Jonathan Frakes obviously is Commander and now Captain Riker, and has already directed a ton of episodes of Star Trek. And the fact that they put him at the helm, so to speak, of this episode, it almost felt like 3 generations of Star Trek coming together. Like the original TOS era, which of course is referenced all over the place on Strange New Worlds, the TNG era with all the references to that, and then of course Riker directing the episode, and then the new era. I mean, I know that Lower Decks takes place in the same like time period as the end of the Next Generation, or perhaps the films, but Lower Decks feels so much like a new era series, filming wise, and it really felt like the 3 main eras of Star Trek were kind of combined into this big soup in this episode. And if you know me, I love soup. And this was a great bowl of Star Trek soup, in my opinion. So let's just briefly go over the plot of the episode. The episode begins like we are watching an animated episode of Lower Decks. The USS Cerritos are conducting a routine check on a thought-to-be dormant portal that was first discovered by Captain Pike and the crew of the Enterprise over a century earlier. After trying to get a picture of Boimler on the thing, it is activated and sends Boimler to the moment in time in which Captain Pike reportedly discovered the portal. Luckily, the crew of the Enterprise are not that shocked by this because of their recent experience with time travel, and they agree to help Boimler get back to his time period. While he is unable to stop himself from geeking out about everything he sees, and also worries that he has inadvertently changed Spock somehow after seeing him with emotions, I think that this was put in for people that are not rabid fans of Star Trek Strange New Worlds and don't know why Spock is behaving differently than he did as Leonard Nimoy. So I think that the writers very smartly threw this in there for people that maybe are just checking out this episode to see if this episode is really as good as everyone is saying, and they don't know everything that has happened in Strange New Worlds up until this point, so they kind of explain it away very early on in this episode. I thought that it also was another example of how Spock is important to the timeline. This was very much referenced in the season 1 finale, Equality of Mercy, but the fact that Boimler and to a certain extent Mariner are so obsessed with not messing up Spock more so than anybody else, it's another time that this series shows us that Spock is really the most important character in the Star Trek universe, and everyone that knows who he is realizes that. After a run-in with some Orion, who the crew first believe are acting like pirates, but turn out to be old scientists as well, they attempt to send Boimler back to his time period. However, This instead brings another member from Boimler's time period to the current one, that being Beckett Mariner, who believes that she is saving him, which is a nice callback to Lower Decks, since that is a recurring theme on that series. Throughout the seasons of Lower Decks, you have this tug and pull with Beckett Mariner and Brad Boimler in their relationship, because at first, Beckett Mariner is the dominant personality and she's ruling everything, and Boimler is kind of in the back seat, and then this affects him and he like overcompensates, and it's Lower Decks is a great show. If you're not watching Lower Decks, you are really missing out on stuff. That's why I didn't give any preamble about like what Lower Decks is when I'm explaining this episode, because I don't want to. I want you to go watch Lower Decks, and this episode should help you get past the fact that it's animated. If you're like, I'm not going to watch Lower Decks because I can't get into animated stuff, this episode of Strange New Worlds should prove to you that yes, you can get into this, because it's just a great show with great characters and great writing. After they hang out some more and possibly change the futures of virtually every member of the Enterprise crew that they come into contact with, Boimler and Mariner remember there's a piece of tech from the NX-01 Enterprise built within the current USS Enterprise that contains the material they need to make the time machine go. A really good callback to the NX-01 Enterprise. Both Cerritos crew members are sent back to their timeline, and when the show cuts back to the crew of the Enterprise, they are now animated. I really thought they looked great animated. Like, I don't know what it was. Maybe because we have seen them in live action so much, but I just thought every character looked really great. Whoever does the animation for Lower Decks, just bang up job. I know there's a lot of bad animation, a lot of bad CGI going on out there, and Star Trek does not have that problem. They really do some great CGI, and they really do some great animation. So kudos to everyone who worked on this episode, all the way down to the animators and up. So let me know, what did you think of this episode? Are you fanboying or fangirling over it? I just really thought it was like perfect. I had really high expectations for this episode. The episode at least met those expectations, maybe even blew them out of the water, but at least met them. I'm very happy with the way this episode went. This really could have been an episode that tanked Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks, because if you think about it, this is a big swing bringing animated characters into the real world, but I really thought they played it off well. It seemed like a lot of thought went into this episode, and I just loved it. So let me know in the comments, what did you think of this episode, and are you as huge a fan of Strange New Worlds as I am now? All right, so now I'm going to go into the Easter eggs from this episode. Now, I know that there are a lot of Easter eggs in this episode, so what I'm going to do is after I release this video on my podcast, I'm going to release a separate video of just the Easter eggs and try and add some pictures and some movie parts to them. I don't know, if you don't follow my channel, you probably don't know that I've had issues with YouTube lately using any kind of live material. I get copyright strikes for some reason when I never got them before. So I haven't been doing a lot of, shots from recent episodes because I don't want my videos to get demonetized. So I haven't been doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this right now, podcast style, with all the Easter eggs, just listing them off. And then in a day or two, I'm going to release a separate video with the same audio from this video, but I'm going to include some more pictures and stuff like that. So if you guys want to see that, look out for that in a couple of days. And then if you just want to skip ahead forward, you can. There are time codes in the description and also in the time bar below. So now let's talk about all the Easter eggs that were in this crossover episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds and Star Trek Lower Decks titled Those Old Scientists. And I'm pretty sure that they reference every single Star Trek series in this episode. So I'm kind of going to count them out as I list them off, so you can check them off at home as well. The title of the episode, Those Old Scientists, comes from a quote from Lower Decks character Commander Ransom from their Season 1 finale, No Small Parts, in reference to the era in which Captain Kirk was active in Starfleet. This turn of phrase abbreviates to TOS, which is also what Star Trek fans call the original series, and at times this era of Star Trek. So I'm going to call this a self-referencing Lower Decks reference. So let's just call this the first reference in this episode to Lower Decks. I know that having two characters from Lower Decks literally references the series, but come on, we're just having some fun here. In the first scene of this episode, you can briefly see the poster of number 1 within Boimler's things. This is referenced later on and then featured at the end of the episode. So the fact that this occurs during like the Lower Decks part of the episode, let's just say that this is the part of the episode where they first reference Star Trek Strange New Worlds. So far, we've referenced Lower Decks and Star Trek Strange New Worlds just in the very first scene. Boimler mentions that Pike's Enterprise is technically the second Enterprise. This could mean one of two things. He could be referencing the Jonathan Archer-led NX-01 Enterprise shown in the series Star Trek Enterprise, or he could be referencing the fact that Pike is the second captain of the NCC 1701 Enterprise after now Admiral Robert April. On the surface of the planet, Rutherford uses a very large holographic imager, which seems antiquated even for this time, since we all have state-of-the-art cameras on our phones now that are a quarter of the size of that thing. But this device does look like the same camera that the EMH Doctor used many times on the USS Voyager, possibly most notably in the 5th season episode Latent Image. And here we have our first reference to the series Voyager. So far we've got the original series, we've got Lower Decks, we've got Strange New Worlds, and we've got Voyager. Boimler and Mariner reference the Starfleet History Museum, which is probably the Fleet Museum that played a big part in the 3rd season of Star Trek Picard, and is probably currently storing the remnants of the Enterprise D, so that LaForge can one day restore it. This is, of course, a reference to the series Star Trek Picard, so now we've referenced that series as well. When Boimler gets sucked into the time machine, he screams, "Remember me," which is a hilarious and very meta reference to the TNG episode Remember Me. The reason I say this is because while Dr. Crusher does get sucked into a vortex in almost the same way that Boimler does in this episode, she doesn't ever say the words, "Remember me." So Boimler is actually referencing the title of a TNG episode to the situation at hand, which I think is hilarious and kind of perfect for his character. And this would be the first reference back to The Next Generation. The Strange New Worlds opening sequence has been animated for this episode and is almost a shot-for-shot remake, except for at least 2 things that I noticed. One is that the same alien that has attached itself to the Cerritos in their opening sequence is also attached to the Enterprise at various times and even falls off. Also, in the final shot, you can see the koala that rules the universe from the Lower Decks episode Mining the Mind's Mines. Planet Setlik 2 is mentioned and is where the Enterprise is set to deliver some grain to. This planet is probably close to Cardassia, since Setlik 3 is where Chief Miles O'Brien became known as the hero of Setlik 3 after Cardassia attacked a Federation outpost there and was part of the reinforcements that fought them off. So technically you could say this is the first reference to Deep Space Nine, since this event is referenced in that series. Number 1 and Pike examine Boimler's Starfleet badge and see that it is also a communicator. The first Starfleet Delta badge in canon that is shown to have been able to also work as a communicator was actually on Star Trek Discovery, but they were the black badges designed by Section 31, so this is our first reference to Star Trek Discovery. When Boimler wakes up, he says, "Computer end program." This is because he thinks he is on a holodeck, which were not developed yet by Starfleet, and also not shown on screen until the first episode of The Next Generation. Before Boimler jumps on the saddle in the Enterprise conference room, he says, "Riker!" This is a reference to the Riker maneuver, and I'm not talking about the one from the film Insurrection. I'm talking about how Jonathan Frakes is tall enough to throw his leg over the back of a chair before sitting on it, much like how Boimler throws his leg up on the saddle. What makes this even funnier is that Jonathan Frakes directed this episode, so Jack Quaid literally got to learn how to do the Riker maneuver from Riker himself. Boimler states that he is on the Enterprise 1701-0. This confirms that the Enterprise was the first ship in Starfleet given the ABC designation, and is probably why we have not seen that many other ships with this type of naming convention. The NX-01 Enterprise was built before Starfleet, so it makes sense why Starfleet would not have started this tradition with that ship. And this would be our first real reference to the series Star Trek Enterprise. Spock's pet Sahat is mentioned by Boimler and is a Vulcan version of a Klingon Targ, a pet that seems too dangerous for a child to play with. This animal was first mentioned by Amanda Grayson in the original series episode Journey to Babel, and was seen on screen in another time travel episode, that being the animated series episode titled Yesteryear, so you could say we have our first reference to the animated series here. After Mariner arrives, she tells Boimler that she was worried that he was stuck in a strange dystopian San Francisco. This is a reference to the DS9 episode Past Tense, in which Sisko, Bashir, and Dax all get trapped in 1990 San Francisco during an event known as the Bell Riots. And I thought to myself, it seems like this was a time that Starfleet didn't worry about time travel, because if people know about this happening like Mariner, then they must have told people that this was a time travel event that the crew of DS9 went on. And it kind of makes sense because at the end of that episode, we see that Sisko has basically replaced one of the main historical figures from that event. So Starfleet was probably like, we're not going to be able to hide this one. We'll just admit it. And that's why people know about the crew of the Defiant going back to a dystopian 1990 San Francisco. Jack Quaid is able to replicate the walking style that his character exhibits on the animated series. And this is just impossible to describe. You just have to see it on screen. He walks with his arms up and his back is straight. It's just really odd. But this, along with the character's purple hair, have led fans to believe that Boimler may be at least part alien. They've never really described in Lower Decks what Boimler is, if he's all human or what. So the fact that he has some of these weird characteristics may mean that he is part alien and that one day we'll learn he's some kind of alien that maybe we've never met before, and they're kind of holding that close to the chest. While looking for an answer, Uhura studies Bajoran and Cardassian languages. This is significant because during this time period, the Federation knows little about these two cultures, but they will become the linchpin of an enormously important event known as the Dominion War during the series Deep Space Nine. In the bar, while trying to blow off some steam, Ortegas mentions Nausicaans in a game known as Damjat. This predator-looking species was introduced during the Next Generation, and a group of Nausicaans stabbed then-cadet Jean-Luc Picard in the heart after playing Damjat, event shown in the Next Generation episode titled Tapestry. When Pelia gives Boimler advice, she says that an old friend once told her, "I always pretended to be someone I wanted to be until finally I became that someone, or he became me." This quote comes from actor Cary Grant, who lived from 1904 to 1986 and was one of the most famous actors on the planet in the 30s and 40s. While Boimler is sneaking around a shuttlecraft, he yells, "Holy Q!" Afterwards, Mariner says, "Don't yell Q, they haven't met him yet. They had kind of a Traylene thing going on." This is referencing, of course, Jean-Luc Picard's greatest enemy outside male pattern baldness, Q, who has been played by John Delancey since his first appearance in the pilot episode of TNG, Encounter at Farpoint. Traylene is a character who showed similar abilities to Q in the original series episode titled The Squire of Gothos, which has led many Trek fans to presume that Traylene is in fact a member of the Q. This comment by Mariner may not only be a reference to this, but also confirmation that this is not the case, since she refers to both as separate entities. At one point, members of the USS Enterprise geek out over their knowledge of the NX-01 Enterprise. They mention the space grappling hooks featured throughout that series that are what ships used before the invention of the tractor beam. Ortegas also reveals that Travis Mayweather is an inspiration, which makes sense since he was the pilot of the Enterprise as she is now. Uhura mentions her admiration for Hoshi Sato, another main character from Star Trek Enterprise, who's also known for creating the first universal translator. Boimler reveals to Number One that she's become synonymous with the phrase ad astra per aspera, which besides being the title of the second episode this season, was also the motto of the United Earth organization that directly predated Starfleet. It was revealed in that episode of Strange New Worlds that the phrase, among other things, was what inspired her to join Starfleet. And during the time of Lower Decks, the phrase, along with Number One's likeness, is now being used to inspire thousands of others to also join Starfleet. I also thought it was funny that Number One was disturbed to think of herself as a pinup model on a poster, since Rebecca Romijn, the actress who plays the character, began her career as a model and was plastered on a lot of young men's walls in the 90s as the character Mystique from the X-Men films. I'm not saying I had a poster of her, but I had a poster of her. Commander Ransom states that Number One is the hottest first officer in Starfleet history. Not only is this the first time I think Ransom has said that someone is better than him, but this is also a very sweet way to compliment his wife in the real world, since the actor who voices Commander Ransom, Jerry O'Connell, is the real-life husband of Rebecca Romijn. Those were all the Easter eggs that I found, but let me know if I missed any. I'm sure I missed one or two because there was a lot to go over, but let me know what Easter eggs were your favorite, and did I miss any in my rundown? So now let's talk about what else was revealed about Strange New Worlds at Comic-Con, and we have some details about Episode 8, Episode 9, and Episode 10. They also revealed the titles of these episodes and what they're about. Now, if you are a fan of this channel, you know that I had this info way back like months ago in a video, but I will repeat it now that it has been confirmed. So Episode 8 is going to be titled Under the Cloak of War, and that will be airing this next week. And it looks like a Klingon-centric episode. I feel like this will have to do with Ortega's past. We've had a lot of references to her being a Klingon war hero. Boimler said something about it in this episode, so I really think that this might be an Ortegas featured episode, and we will see what she did in the Klingon War, and possibly also what Nurse Chapel and Dr. Mbenga were doing during the Klingon War. The 9th episode of the season looks like another special and another first time for Star Trek, which this will be the first musical episode of Star Trek, and it is titled Subspace Rhapsody. They released a trailer for this, and honestly, I have a hard time watching trailers for episodes that I want to see because I really don't want anything spoiled, and I don't want to spoil anything for anybody else. So what I did was I just watched the preview for the episode, and I didn't let myself listen to any dialogue. I know that sounds probably psycho to some people, but for the purposes of this video, I wanted to see something about the trailer and not know, and know something about it, but I didn't want to get anything ruined. So besides this being the first musical episode for any cast of Star Trek, I did see that Kirk is also involved in this episode, and this will be at least the third episode of the second season that Paul Wesley will be playing James Kirk. I think they're using him a bit much, and I hope that in future seasons they don't use him as much because I really like this cast and I want to see more cast members featured, and when they feature Paul Wesley as James Kirk, they take away time from another cast member. So let's not use James Kirk as much next season, guys. I think that two actresses that will shine in this episode will be Celia Rose Gooding and Christina Chong. Celia Rose Gooding is a Tony and Grammy award-winning actress, and Christina Chong is also a vocalist who started her career in musical theater, and she also released 2 pop singles this year. So these are 2 very accomplished singers. I'm sure there are others in the cast as well. There's a lot of Anson Mount singing in the trailer, so maybe he has a voice too. But I think this is going to be a great episode. I usually don't like musical episodes, but I think that this will be a good one. And then the season finale this season will be called Hegemony. I feel like I always pronounce that word wrong. I want to call it hegemony, like hedge money, like I'm giving you money for a hedge. And I know that's not right. So anyway, it's going to be about the Gorn. It's probably going to be a really deep episode setting up, season 3. Maybe season 3 might be a little darker. It might be a little more focused on the Gorn, or there'll be a bigger threat. I've mentioned before that first contact with the Gorn doesn't happen until the original series. So it will be interesting how the crew of Strange New Worlds get around that. But I do think that, Subspace Rhapsody being a musical episode, it's going to be a very light episode. And then they're going to take us right back down with the season finale. And this might be a very dark episode. And hopefully we don't lose anybody. Last season, of course, we lost Hemmer towards the end of the season, and I hope they don't do that again with any of these characters, because I'm really growing to love all these characters. And if this were like the last season for Ortegas or something, I would just be devastated, and I really hope they don't do something silly like that. So let me know, are you excited for the rest of the season of Strange New Worlds? I think it's going to be great. I think that all 3 episodes are going to be really good and have really big ramifications to the cast and also, the Star Trek universe as a whole. But let me know what you think of the future of Strange New Worlds in the comments below. So now let's talk about that Lower Decks Season 4 trailer. If you follow me, you know that I am also a huge fan of Lower Decks, so I cannot wait for this season to come out. And especially after this episode of Strange New Worlds, it reminds me how great those characters are. And now I really can't wait. So we know that the first episode will be debuting on September 7th. Which means we'll have about a month from the end of the season of Strange New Worlds and the beginning of the season of Lower Decks. I think that's smart. I think in the past, they've done things back to back. And I think you get burnout when you just have to continually watch Star Trek every week. That may seem smart on paper, like we're just continually inundating fans with more Star Trek week after week. But I don't think practically it works as well. I think it's good to give fans a breather a little bit and say okay, you've got a month off to either catch up on Lower Decks, watch the rest of the season of Strange New Worlds, binge it, or just watch something else besides Star Trek and then come back to Star Trek, in a month when Lower Decks comes on. I think that's really smart. So in season 4, the crew of the Cerritos is about to take on their biggest mission yet, as they are tasked with figuring out who's behind a string of attacks on non-Federation vessels once they begin targeting Starfleet. And the trailer begins with a short narration by none other than Jonathan Frakes. He has yet to direct an episode of Lower Decks, which I found interesting. I don't know why that is, and perhaps this season he will finally direct an episode. He has appeared, well, I shouldn't say appear, but Riker has appeared a few times on Lower Decks, and he returned to voice him, but he has not directed an episode yet. Maybe he will after directing this episode of Strange New Worlds. And I've also said this before, but let's just give him a Star Trek show. I mean, he has definitely paid his dues, but sometimes I feel like, and I'm going to use a sports analogy here, and I know how people love sports analogies, but sometimes you have a really great player that you don't just put in one position, that you make it so he can play multiple positions because he's great at a lot of things. And maybe that's something they're doing with Jonathan Frakes. And instead of just pigeonholing him into one series, they're saying, we're just going to let you sprinkle your magic on everything we do, which sounds kind of gross. It sounded better. It sounded better in my head. But anyway, moving on. I think that he is so good and so important to this franchise that I might just give him a Star Trek show, but maybe that's why they haven't just given him a show yet, because he's so good that they want him everywhere. They don't want to just put him in one place. We also see Captain Freeman discussing an attack on a Binar vessel. The Binars were introduced in the TNG episode 11001001 during the first season. It also shows this entity attacking Romulans and Klingons. There are lots of quick shots of the season, but one of the most prominent figures is T'Lyn, and now she is a member of the Cerritos crew. If you remember, her character debuted in the second season episode Wedge Dooge, and it's really interesting, her character, because the concept of the character was created by Catherine Lynn, who wrote that episode, and she is based on a Vulcan that Lynn cosplayed at conventions for several years before actually joining Star Trek. So this was somebody that she created in her own head and was cosplaying, and now this character is an actual Star Trek canon character. I think that is just great. Kudos to Catherine Lynn for getting that done. And after becoming a writer on Lower Decks, Catherine Lynn went on to become the supervising producer on Strange New Worlds and was also one of the writers on Those Old Scientists. So I just think that that is really great, that she's not only been a writer on Lower Decks, but she's also a writer on Strange New Worlds. You know, I love when Star Trek is able to find people that actually love Star Trek to work on their projects. The creator of Lower Decks, Mike McMahon, has described T'Lyn as the Vulcan version of Beckett Mariner. I don't think that that necessarily means that T'Lyn will be like wild and crazy like Beckett Mariner. I think that Beckett Mariner really shows like the worst parts of being a human, you know, like the fact that like she doesn't care about a lot of stuff and, you know, flies by the seat of her pants and stuff. Like everything that a Vulcan hates about humans is what Beckett Mariner is. And I think that T'Lyn will be the opposite of that. She will be everything that humans hate about Vulcans. So I expect her to be a character very much like the Vulcans from the Star Trek Enterprise, who were even bigger dicks than the Vulcans that we usually see, if you can imagine. Later in the trailer, Commander Ransom tells Boimler that a promotion may be on the way. I bet that this will be a plot line that kind of exists throughout the season. And at the end of the season, I would not be surprised if T'Lyn gets it. They would kind of be perfect that all the four main characters stay on the Lower Decks, and T'Lyn is just like a visitor, and then she's with them for one season, and then she gets promoted. Also, Tendi and Rutherford are working together a lot, and I think there's a scene of them together on Ferenginar during a celebration. I don't think we've ever actually seen Ferenginar. I know there was an episode of Deep Space Nine, at least one, when they showed the interior of Quark's mom's house, but I don't think we ever saw the outside of Ferenginar. And there's also a shot in the trailer of the crew landing a shuttle in a city with like these bright gold lights, and it's raining. And I remember in Deep Space Nine, Quark or somebody else said that it's always raining on Ferenginar. So I think that we're going to Ferenginar for the first time in this season of Lower Decks. I also saw that there's like this girls' night out in green where it looks like Mariner, Tendi, and T'Lyn are at an Orion bar, and then Mariner like takes a knife to the shoulder, which he just like brushes off. There's also a shot of Ransom and Shax doing the weird calisthenics that Dr. Crusher and Troy did in the third season TNG episode, The Price, and they're also wearing the same outfits. And I thought it was also funny that like Shax couldn't take it, like he has to let go and falls apart. I think that that's pretty much the only scene from The Price that anybody ever remembers, so you probably know what scene I'm talking about in regards to Dr. Crusher and Troy. There's also a shot of Andy Billup's family from the episode Where Pleasant Fountains Lie. And this possibly teases a return to Hesperia, where it's kind of like, you know, the Camelot times and everybody's like a king and stuff like that. There are characters that look like they're from Hesperia on the Cerritos, and they're toasting, and one has a hat that says it is Romulan Ale o'clock somewhere. If that isn't a product, I'm sure that somebody is working on it right now to sell, because I'm sure that that will sell very well in the real world. There's also a quick shot of a shuttle going towards what looks like to me the station from Star Trek Beyond, Starbase Yorktown. You know, that one that's like a circle and all looks like a big city. I know that there's a scientific reason for why it's shaped like a circle, but I don't remember what it was. But it looks like they may be going to Starbase Yorktown in Lower Decks, which is kind of funny because, of course, that was in the J.J. Abrams universe. So maybe this is the version of the Starbase Yorktown in this universe. Towards the end of the trailer, Mariner also references to Boimler their adventure on Strange New Worlds. And I thought that this was funny because I wonder, from their perspective, is it a big deal to discuss going back in time? Because I understand why when you're back in time, you can't discuss the future. But when you're in the future, is it also as big a deal to discuss the past? Because you can't really change anything, right? Like you're already back to the future. So I would imagine that they could freely talk about their time traveling back to the past. And maybe that's why I referenced this earlier, that Mariner knew about the DS9 crew going back to 1990 San Francisco, maybe when people travel back to the past, it's not as big a deal as when people travel to the future. I don't know, but I just thought it was kind of interesting how they referenced that. And it made me think like, yeah, maybe it's not as big a deal to travel back in time. Besides the trailer, there was also a poster for season 4 revealed, which is a direct reference to Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, which makes sense that they would reference Star Trek IV since this is the 4th season of Lower Decks. On the poster, you can see, besides the main cast, that Badgie is there, teasing his return. The character debuted in the first season episode Terminal Provocations. He is voiced by comedic actor Jack McBrayer, who is best known for his role as Kenneth on 30 Rock. He is also a part of one of my favorite videos on YouTube. I feel like I've been watching it for like a decade. And just search Jack McBrayer and Triumph visit Chicago's Wiener Circle. It's as weird as the title sounds, but it is hilarious. It's a great way to waste 10 minutes. But going back to Badgie, Badgie was a hologram designed by Ensign Sam Rutherford in the form of an anthropomorphic Starfleet insignia. After developing emotions, Badgie becomes hostile towards Rutherford and was seemingly destroyed in the first season finale. But in the third season finale, Rutherford learned that the admiral that designed the Texas-style class ship had used Rutherford's design for Badgie as an operating system. Because of this, Badgie came back stronger than ever, killed the admiral, and had to be stopped by the entire California-class fleet. But before the episode ended, an unseen ship retrieved Badgie from the wreckage. So obviously he may even be, once again, a part of the main villain this season. And actually, if you see that thing, it does kind of look like an upside-down Starfleet Delta. So maybe this is like an evolved version of Badgie. Speaking of evolved, on the poster, there's also a picture of Agamus, who was voiced by Jeffrey Combs, and he was introduced in the second season episode, Where Pleasant Fountains Lie. And in that episode, they left him at the Daystrom Institute in a Raiders of the Lost Ark-esque secret vault. But he then returned in the third season episode, A Mathematically Perfect Redemption, after the character Peanut Hamper was also placed next to it. So I almost feel like the bad guy of this season may be like the melded version of Badgie, Agamus, and Peanut Hamper, because they may all be in the same area of this like Starfleet vault. And if somehow they're able to combine themselves, they would obviously be like this powerful being. And if you look at the design of this thing in the trailer, it does look a little bit like Agamus. Like it's got that like blinking light like Agamus had. So it leads me to believe that maybe it is a combination of these three characters. I was not a fan of Peanut Hamper, but I am a fan of Badgie and Agamus. So I'd be a little sad if they combine those characters into like this Tuvix, because we would either lose the voice of Jeffrey Combs or Jack McBrayer, who I think did great jobs as those characters. And I definitely don't want to lose that. But that's kind of my thoughts about season 4 of Lower Decks. Let me know, did you watch the trailer? I'll put a link to the trailer in the description below. What did you think of it? Are you a fan of Lower Decks? And are you excited for the upcoming season? Let me know in the comments below. And then finally, let's talk about that season 5 clip that was shown during Comic-Con for Star Trek Discovery. Some people I know are wondering if Star Trek Discovery is going to be impacted by the writers or actors strike, but all signs point to the fact that it was completed before any of this nonsense happened. So there should not be an issue with season 5. And even though they went back to do reshoots after it was announced that this would be the final season of Discovery, I believe that everything is complete and it will not be affected by the strike. So during the clip, we see Michael Burnham talking to guest star Eve Harlow, who I'm actually a fan of. She played characters in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Heroes Reborn that I really liked. So I like that she is a part of the season. So she is there with a Kelpian. And I don't think we've seen a Kelpian like this before. He looks kind of like a grubby like Kelpian, like he's like some kind of bad guy. And usually the Kelpians that we see are all real nice and benevolent. So it's interesting to see a Kelpian from the other side of the tracks. Eve Harlow's character is holding what seems to be the point of whatever the quest is this season. The writers on the season of Discovery have said this is going to be like a treasure hunt kind of season. And the thing that she's holding looks kind of like a Rubik's Cube that is unfinished. If you notice, there's a couple of notches on it that look black and white while everything else is like brown or colored. So whatever this is, it's important and everybody's looking for it. Then the Kelpian throws a device at Burnham that creates a portal that I thought was very similar to the one used by Vadic at the Starfleet Recruitment Center in season 3 of Picard. If you watch that show, there was a scene where there was like this, it looked like an explosion, but it wasn't an explosion. This like portal opened underneath this building and the building just like fell and then the portal opened up above it. So it was really weird. And it looks like whatever this Kelpian throws during the trailer, it's like a smaller version of that device. I also noticed that Kovich is on the bridge of the Discovery. This character is one that I think we will see more of this season. I also tend to believe that he may be involved in the new series, Star Trek Starfleet Academy, if that series ever gets made, thanks to the writers and actors strike. Burnham then finds the cloaked ship and attaches herself to it, and it goes to warp. I thought that was a pretty cool scene. I don't know that we've ever seen anybody on the outside of a ship as it goes to warp. It kind of reminded me of somebody like on a train, like robbing a train. While she's there, another Starfleet ship catches up to them and throws on a tractor beam, and we hear the voice of guest star Calum Keith Rennie, who will be a main character this season, and his name is Rayner. I believe he's the captain of that ship. This guy has appeared in a lot of stuff as like a background character actor, but I remember him most from the last season of the Umbrella Academy. I also noticed that there's a reference to Commander Detmer, and it appears that she has been promoted either in the early parts of this season or at the end or in between fourth and fifth season. And you may remember her as a lieutenant, but she was promoted to lieutenant commander before the fourth season. So she's rising up the ranks pretty fast, which is good because this is the last season of Discovery. So if you're going to do something, girl, you better do it now. But anyway, the trailer ends and says that this final season will be coming in 2024, but no definite date yet. I think that it would be during the beginning of the year, but when they first designed this was before the writers and actors strike, and they probably thought they'd have another season in the can of either Lower Decks or Strange New Worlds, and they will not because of the writers and actors strike. So maybe they will push this out a little bit further into the year. So we'll see when this comes out in 2024, but I'm guessing it will be somewhere in the first quarter of the year. So let me know, did you watch this clip? I will also link this in the description below if you'd like to check it out. What did you think of it? Did it get you excited for the final season of Star Trek Discovery, or are you just over Discovery now and don't really care and would like to just move on with Strange New Worlds, Lower Decks, and the rest of the new stuff that Star Trek is going to put out? Well, that's all I have this time. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining me and sticking to the end of this video. If you have stuck out to the end, why not hit that like button if you haven't yet? Because you must like what I'm saying now if you stuck around for this long. And if you do like me, then why don't you hit that subscribe button as well if you haven't done that yet? It really does a lot to help out my small channel. Thanks again for joining me this week, and I will see you next time on What Did I Miss?